Let's go ahead and get started and just introduce ourselves. So my name is Matt Sainer. I lead security specialist architecture for what we call AWS Industries. And really all that means is I get to speak to some of our largest, most complex customers across the globe, across multiple industries, to try to help them achieve their business outcomes using security.
Hey everyone, my name is Mike Lapadakis, and I lead a team of specialist SAs here at AWS. Really excited to be here today. I've been at AWS for about 8 years now, working with a variety of different customers in an SA role. And this is the production of the Generative AI Scoping Matrix is definitely one of our team's proudest achievements. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to getting your feedback when we're done.
So let's start off with at least setting the stage. What do we hope that you take away from our opportunity to meet together today? We're going to go through kind of 4 key questions. The first one is, where do we start? If we're all security practitioners or have something to do with security, does Gen AI radically change the equation for what we need to do and approach with a generative AI workloads? The second is, how are we as AWS thinking about security in Gen AI? What's the convergence points? What's unique about that? And then we'll talk about how we're going to scope the conversation to talk to one of those areas. Then we're going to talk about a mechanism. Hint, hint, it might be in the title of the presentation, but we're going to go into that mechanism, what it is, how you can use it, how you can deploy it at your organizations, how this is really becoming not just an AWS idea, but really an industry-wide idea that has kind of proliferated out there. And then we're going to give some examples. We're going to go into each areas of the matrix and talk a little bit about how that applies under certain scenarios and topics. So as we start, we're not going to go through the details of what Gen AI is or isn't, but let's just give at least a level playing field so we know the context of the talk today. Right, generative AI is transforming our industry. I think of things in terms of evolutions of time versus revolutions in technology, right? So maybe when we had traditional data centers, we went from bare metal servers to virtual machines, and that's kind of a big evolution. And then when we went from data centers to cloud, that was more of a revolution. The way we build applications, the way we think about applications, API-driven building really changed that equation. And this really has changed the equation here. So let's do just a little bit of disambiguation. AI, ML, not new, been around for a long time. I'm not a data scientist. Mike isn't a data scientist. We're security practitioners. We really used as a consumer or an end user what those smart people built and enabled through other products and services. Very predictive in the way. GuardDuty is a great example. GuardDuty is a product we have that helps detect anomalous behavior, uses traditional AI ML under the covers, and some of the examples that might come up that we've seen traditional AI ML use cases pretty prevalent in industry are listed there. Generative AI is different. It's used to create content. It's non-deterministic. So this could be text, it could be voice, it could be video. And this is a very different area of traditional AI than we're used to, but it's also democratized AI ML. So folks like Mike and myself and you, who might not be data scientists, can now take advantage of these radically transformative technologies. So one of the things that I've co-opted this term, I didn't invent it, but I love it. It's called eating your security vegetables. What do I mean by that? We want to think about, if you think about one of our first questions we want to talk about today, does this mean that I have to approach security of generative AI workloads in a completely different way? Is it upending everything I know? And that was the question that Mike, me, and our teams last year were really trying to challenge ourselves with. And the first epiphany that we kind of came to was no, right? We want to think about eating our security vegetables. We want to think about this as an extension of our data problems, right? It is a data problem in and of itself, and then you're building other components around that, applications around that. You're thinking about identity, you're thinking about logging, monitoring, transparency, all of these things. So we like to think of it as the food pyramid. If you're familiar with that, eat your security vegetables, get those basics right, apply those to the nuances of generative AI, and understand those nuances.
And with that, it's important to remember that you shouldn't be boiling the ocean. If you're doing your security fundamentals correctly, you're already well on your way to securing your generative AI applications. The key here is to scope the workload, scope the conversation, scope the risks, and scope the controls. When we talk about generative AI security, there's 3 legs to the stool, generally, in our discussions. The first leg of the stool is securing generative AI applications. The next is leveraging security AI to augment and improve your existing security practices and organization. And the third is protecting your organization against emerging and novel threats from generative AI. What we're here today to talk about is securing the generative AI applications within your organization. Now, about a little over a year ago, we set out to understand how security professionals and developers were having these conversations, how they were discussing generative AI within their organizations. And what we found was that there was a fundamental mismatch. There was a miscommunication. So we set out to create a common language so that security practitioners and professionals and developers could have consistent, timely conversations around this without getting in the way of the ambiguities of what generative AI is and the different application types. So we created this concept of scopes, which are essentially application types. The first set of scopes are by scopes. So for scope 1, we have your consumer off-the-shelf applications that may be leveraged within your organization. Some may consider this shadow IT. Scope 2 are your enterprise applications. Now moving into the build scopes, scope 3 are your pre-trained models. Scope 4 are your fine-tuned models. This is when your organization brings data into the model itself. And scope 5 are your self-trained models. Now in our experience, most recently, most organizations that we speak with are primarily focused on scope 2 and 3. That's changing over time, but to date, that's been the concentration of discussions that we've had. Now with that, we've overlaid this with security domains. So those security domains are governance and compliance, legal and privacy, risk management, controls, and resilience. And for the remainder of this presentation, we're going to go deep into each one of these scopes and domains to give you actionable advice on how you can implement the security scoping matrix within your organization and begin to have these detailed conversations with the development teams that you partner with.
All right, so throughout this presentation, we're going to refer back to a data diagram, a data flow diagram, and you're going to see how each scope that changes. But let's just start off with a baseline, regardless of scope, of what the major components you would find in almost any generative AI application. Of course, you can always build complexity. There's always the detailed low-level architecture and engineering diagrams and designs. But for the most part, you can kind of see this fitting the model for most applications. So the first one is you have a user, and that user could be a human user. It could also be a machine user, but you have a user. And they're providing an input into an application layer, right? This application layer may or may not also augment that input with additional contextualized data. So in our world, we might think about how Amazon Q Business, for example, might have a native retriever or a custom retriever with a backend data source. Bedrock might have various other agents or abilities for it to pull in data from data sources or whatever it might be you're building on. We call this, not just we, but the industry calls this retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. Is everybody familiar with RAG? Is that something folks have heard? Okay, I see some nods. So this is really important, and we'll hit on RAG throughout this presentation, because I think understanding how it impacts the security posture of your data, again, talking about this being a native extension of existing data problems, is really the key, one of the key takeaways here. So that augments the response. The application sends the finalized prompt, if you will, with all the context data in that context window to a model. That model could be what we call a foundation model, which means this is a set of a large language model that's trained on a corpus of data, usually a very large corpus of data. Bedrock has our service that allows you to basically use a marketplace where you have first-party models like Titan or third-party models from Meta, Anthropic, AI21 Labs, et cetera. But ultimately, that model has a corpus of set training data and then potentially fine-tuned data. So we'll talk about how that changes over the courses of the scopes. Then the model takes that prompt, provides a completion back to the AI application. The AI application may, at that point, do something else with that output, and then provides that response to the user, again, machine identity or human identity. More on that to come. So let's talk about if we're going to go into the details of each scope. Maybe there's things that are universal truths. So let's start there. So the first thing, and I don't know if we see this as much in 2024 as we saw in 2023. I think people have started to understand how this applies to them better. But the first thing that was kind of a knee-jerk reaction was, Gen AI is something I don't understand, and because I don't understand it, I don't know the risk. And because I don't know the risk, what I'm going to do is just say, no, I'm not going to use it in my organization. To Mike's earlier point, that creates the impetus for shadow IT. And what's wrong with shadow IT? Right? No visibility. I don't know where my data is going. I don't know how people are using this. I don't even know what they're using. They're going to the coffee shop with their phone and doing things that I would prefer them not to do. So first off, don't outright ban Gen AI. What you do want to do is empower your users, and you want to empower your users through education, policy, controls on the back end that help enforce that, but also enablement. So maybe that's giving them channels to create their own Gen AI applications, or you create one for your workforce. Also, make sure you understand and reinforce what your data policies are, and where are your controls, right? Where are you looking at this? We also think about the model versioning. So models don't stay static. They change, and they may rapidly change. But understanding how those changes impact what your inputs and your outputs are is really important when you start building in the higher-end scopes. The key takeaway from this slide, obviously not going to just read the bullets on it. What the key takeaway is, the world is changing. It's rapidly evolving. Especially if you're in regulated industries, you want to keep an eye on what is impacting your industry, or in certain geographies, what are the emerging regulations and governing bodies that may be driving change here. We as a provider are certainly on top of this. We're participating in these work groups. We're participating with these policymakers, et cetera, to help understand what it means and have a high bar for compliance opportunities there and enablement. So resilience, we think about the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, availability as kind of cornerstones for security, information security, and availability. Part of that would be resilience. So we want to also include resilience in the way we think about that. And that drastically changes in the way you think about especially Scope 1, Scope 2, and beyond. So think about that. And also think about how if you are training or fine-tuning a model, the resiliency for the data that you might be using to do that. So let's jump in to deep dive on the unique opportunities for each scope. The first one is the consumer app. And, okay, show of hands, who uses something like ChatGPT? Okay. Who's played with Amazon Party Rock? All right, great, right? Like, these are great examples of consumer-grade apps. These are apps that are typically free, right? So when apps are free, you have to really understand what are the terms and conditions in the end-user license agreements of how they're going to use your data. But let's talk really quickly about like this data flow diagram now. So if you're familiar with the shared responsibility model, we are kind of in the same vein of that. We're looking at what is a provider control and a consumer control. And everything in the purple color here would be the provider control. You are only really responsible for the data you feed into this application, whether that's directly through a chatbot, web interface prompts, text input, or through any other kind of agents or plugins that may interface with data that you want to feed it. But ultimately, the provider is fully responsible for that control. So when you think about the governance and compliance, what we really want to think about is, again, educating that workforce. What does it mean to use a publicly available, free if you will, Gen AI application, right? We want to make sure that we understand how is the data that you're using going to be provided, what data would you like to provide, and how are you using the outputs of that. One thing that I think is really important, and this is an example of an acceptable use policy, is if you look at this, it's written in very plain English, very simple and easy and quick to consume language. It's not written in 54 pages of legalese that no one's going to scroll through, right? We've all seen that where you just scroll to the bottom, click accept, and write that. But if this is something that you can use for your workforce or something like this, where you can say, if you want to use Gen AI, here's what you're accountable for. Here's what you're responsible for. Oh, and here's maybe the link to the data policy, right? So it's very clear, concise language. Maybe the most important aspect of this, and we'll compare this across scopes as well, which is what data is acceptable from a classification perspective to use in various scopes. Our recommendation is do not use PII, do not use proprietary or sensitive data in Scope 1 apps. You can generally validate this through the end user license agreement, terms and conditions, EULAs, et cetera, that are published by these. At least start with the assumption, do not do that, right? Also, understanding what is the legal implications of using outputs. Different providers, different models have different legal considerations for what that means in terms of can you use it, what's the copyright impacts, et cetera. Risk management, so you'll see the difference here between scopes 1 and 2 and 3, 4, and 5 is that in 1 and 2, we're really thinking about third-party risk management. So you probably, especially large organizations, probably have procurement departments. How are you adopting third-party services? And those risk assessments should be extended. And in fact, we've talked to customers who said, hey, we are going to use the security scoping matrix as part of our procurement processes, and then build in the checks and balances that they want to do for various scopes as they build or buy. So that's something to really think about. In controls here are really, I guess, the typical controls that we're used to in terms of SaaS-based application. If you're going out and using a web application, how do you think about DLP today? How do you think about your CASB or your proxy controls? Now, we are seeing some emergent solutions come out, both at the client layer and at the network layer, that can help with this as well. So as that continues to evolve, there'll be more that are niche and specific to Gen AI type services. But ultimately, you're kind of just seeing the visibility. What are my employees using? How are they using it? Et cetera. Resilience, I guess the key takeaway here is probably not going to have an SLA, right? Scope 1 apps, best effort. It's available. I would recommend not building key business workflow processes to use Scope 1 apps, because if you do and it's not available, you have no recourse, right? At least no legal recourse. So let's talk about Scope 2. And the thing I would say here is if you pause for just 5 seconds and look at this, what's the difference in the diagram? And because it's a silent session and we're not interactive, I'll answer the question for us, which is nothing. The diagram is exactly the same, right? So provider control, consumer control is identical. So what is the key differentiator here? The key differentiator here is the kind of data you might want to use in this, because you have a legal relationship now. You have an enterprise agreement. You have a contract. You have something that you can now rely on, certain qualifications and guarantees, per se, from that provider. So let's jump into this. And as we go through the rest of the deck, you'll see some color there, like the pink or fuchsia color, is really the additive or differentiated piece between the previous scope. So now we just want to understand, what is that third-party provider going to do with my data? Are they going to have a third-party, fourth-party relationship? And if I am a regulated industry or I have specific geographic requirements, if my data needs to be stored in certain geo for whatever reason, can that provider meet those obligations for me? Understanding what's the acceptable data classification. So our opinion is Scope 1 apps, no PII, no sensitive data. Scope 2 apps, what do you think? Do you think you could do that? Yeah, absolutely, right? Because this is the differentiator. Amazon Q Business is a great example of this, where Q Business without data would just be talking to an LLM. Q business with your data is the differentiator for you to have contextual data that enables your workforce to get to generated outputs that really drive you forward based on that contextual data. And that could be, that could be customer data, it could be whatever, might be driving your lab and R&D efforts, right? So it could be a variety of data, but that's a big difference. Risk management doesn't really change because you're still thinking about third-party evaluation and the things that go along with that. But the big difference on controls is identity context matters, right? We heard it in the keynote this morning when we think about trust that Eli Lilly talked about on stage, and then we heard Steve and Chris talk about zero trust. It sounds counterintuitive, but they both go hand in hand. The zero trust being that everything's authenticated, and without authenticated context, I can now think about this customer service rep might have ability to access this region's customers' data, but this one can't, right? Maybe private bankers have access to very sensitive details of customers, whereas a normal teller doesn't. And that context can feed the right data into the prompts so that you have that context. So you can federate your enterprise identity. So on the resilience, the other difference here is, again, legal relationship. So they are probably more willing or actually publish SLAs, right? So you can now build around your critical business processes. And from here, we're going to go from the buy part of the proposition to the build part of the proposition. Mike's going to walk us through that.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. So scope 3 is where things fundamentally change with the generative AI security scoping matrix. As Matt said, that's where we shift from buying something to actually building something. And in that scenario, you'll notice here that the application itself is now green. Your organization now owns the application, the security of that application. And generally, the way that those applications interact with foundation models is through APIs. Those APIs can link to either open source or closed source models. And some examples of that would be Amazon Bedrock on some of the base models that they have, including Amazon Titan and Meta's Llama. Also important here is your organization's data is primarily being leveraged within the application through that RAG-based architecture that was mentioned earlier. So none of your organization's data resides within the model itself. Shifting to governance, for scope 3, what we see the primary difference is that you should understand the data that the model was used to train. This is one thing that as you're consuming a model now, that may be in the selection criteria. What data was used in the training of that particular model that's being selected? Legal and privacy, each model has an end user license agreement or a EULA. Those end user license agreements oftentimes dictate what sort of data can be used within that model. So you may find that some models do not permit the use of PII, for instance. So it's critical that when you're selecting a model, you review the EULA for that particular model and ensure that it's right for your use case, that they're not sending the wrong sort of data. You also want to make sure that any of the information that's being sent to that particular model or endpoint is being used in a way you'd expect it to be used. So again, we want to make sure that it's not being used to retrain or to improve the underlying services, that no one's looking at your data itself. And you also want to seek to understand the shared responsibility model of whatever service is ultimately providing those foundation models to you. So oftentimes, Amazon Bedrock as an example, there'll be a shared responsibility model that's associated with the service that's hosting the model. So this is something that your legal team, your privacy team may want to take a look at in addition. Now here's one of the most substantial shifts that we have in the generative AI scoping matrix, and that is when you own the application, you also are responsible for threat modeling and understanding the risks to that particular application. And so to best understand that, to best explain that, we decided to leverage one of the many frameworks that are out there, and that's the OWASP Top 10 for LLM. There are others as well, like the MITRE framework, that help us understand the threats that are out there and how to begin to discuss and mitigate them and threat model against them. So for that, and we have a handful of the threats here for our OWASP Top 10 for LLMs for Scope 3, but I'll just call out a few. So prompt injection, for instance. This is when a threat actor is attempting to use your model, use your application in a malicious way. So they're trying to break out of some of the maybe controls that you've put in place using creative language in order to trick that particular model to do something that it shouldn't. Another example would be insecure plugin design. So more and more we see these models interacting with other downstream applications through things like agents or LangChain or plugins. And as you're threat modeling your particular application, it's critical that those things are also included in your threat model, because the LLM is ultimately communicating with those things to get them to do things within your environment. And finally, I'll call out model denial of service. This is similar to any other denial of service where a threat actor may attempt to disable or take down your particular model through flooding the endpoint, flooding that API with requests, either false requests or legitimate requests that ultimately make it unavailable to end users, or worse, could cause it to provide degraded results. Now, for controls, we must consider who has access to the model itself. Today, once a model is trained, there's no way to adjust or to have fine-grained controls on what data is returned from that model. So it's important to know that if you're providing an application access to a model with a little bit of guardrails, you may be able to control the sort of information that is sent to it or returned, but within the model itself, it's going to actually return the same information for every request. There's no way to fine-grain control that, so just something to call out there. In addition, you could put a web application firewall, data loss prevention appliance, or other technology in between the application itself and the prompt being sent to that model in order to filter or to reduce the type of requests that are going to that. So if you do want to eliminate some of the potential risks of sending data to that, you could. Now, in addition to that, there is guardrails for Bedrock. Now, guardrails for Bedrock allows you to use guardrails with any model within AWS Bedrock or Amazon Bedrock. There are different types of guardrails you can set up. First, you can set up harmful content filtering guardrails, or potentially domain filtering guardrails. And finally, we've added the addition of PII. So you can filter out any sort of PII that would be included in the completion of that particular API request. Now, for resilience in Scope 3, we're going to break this down into two primary categories. These are self-hosted models and API services. For self-hosted models, you'll want to consider what sort of instance types are being used and whether the instance types are available in a particular region. You may even consider pre-provisioning instances so that the capacity is available if there is a spike. For API services, it's important to understand where your API, where that particular service is available prior to deploying your application in that region. So if the API service that you're leveraging isn't available in a particular region, you may choose to deploy your application in a different region where that API service is available. Now, moving on to Scope 4. Scope 4 is where your organizational data is now going to be included in the model. So you'll notice the addition just north of that fine-tune model box, fine-tuning data. That's your organization's data that's being leveraged in order to augment a model. When it comes to governance and compliance, the primary difference here, the primary focus here with Scope 4 is controlling access to the fine-tuned model. Now, it's critical to understand that the data that was leveraged in fine-tuning that particular model now inherits the classification of the model itself, or vice versa. So essentially what that means is there is no way to filter data coming out of a model. So if you train a model on sensitive company information, confidential company information, that model now becomes confidential as well. So you'll want to control access to that model in the same way. From the legal and privacy perspective, you want to avoid, generally, fine-tuning a model with sensitive information types. And again, that's for the same reason. We can't filter the information coming out of that model outside of leveraging something like guardrails. So you'll want to do as much as you can to prevent actually training with that model to begin with. And again, you want to restrict access to that fine-tuned model. When it comes to risk management, there are 2 additional OWASP top 10 for LLM risks that we add for Scope 4. The first is training data poisoning. This is when somebody, a malicious threat actor, attempts to adjust or modify the training data in order to manipulate, ultimately, the results that your model produces. And model theft. If you've trained a model with confidential information or proprietary information, something that your organization wants to keep private, stealing that model obviously would not be a good thing. So now we must consider, in addition to the other top 10 for LLM, model theft. So with that, what controls for Scope 4 should we consider implementing? Well, first, identity and access management for each of those fine-tuned models. Second, encryption. So with Amazon Bedrock, for instance, we can leverage KMS, where you can bring your own encryption key material in order to encrypt those fine-tuned models. And then finally, we want to look at the monitoring use of those models for any irregularities. So perhaps somebody is using the model in an application that you didn't anticipate. Making sure that you have proper monitoring in place will help to catch those sort of things early. In resilience for Scope 4, we have the addition on the self-hosting side for a data management strategy, as you have that new fine-tuned data that you want to replicate potentially to another region in the event that you do need to fine-tune another model in another region. And for the API services, you may want to consider fine-tuning the model in another region and making it available in the event that you did need to fail over to another region or leverage that model in another region for any reason. And with that, we come to Scope 5. Now, I'll admit, this is the rarest scope. I don't think I've come across this yet with customers, and that is training a model from the ground up with that organization's data or data that that organization purchases outright. So you'll see here in our diagram that every single box is now the responsibility of the organization. Not only are they responsible for the application and the organization data, but they're also responsible for the foundation model itself and bringing the data to that foundation model in order to train it. From a governance and compliance perspective, it is nearly identical to Scope 4. There is no additional elements here. When it comes to legal and privacy for Scope 5, there's a slight adjustment. Now, if you're making this model available to end users, you should consider creating an end user license agreement, or EULA, for that model. You'll also want to limit how you use the customer data once it's being leveraged within that model itself. And when we come to risk management, it's identical to Scope 4. We still have the same LLM top 10 risks, OWASP LLM top 10 risks from Scope 4. And finally, controls are identical as well. And with resilience, we've eliminated now the idea of an API endpoint. We're focusing primarily on self-hosting at this point because the entire process is under your control. And with that, we'd recommend that during the training process, you take checkpoints regularly. And if you do need to retrain, you can leverage those checkpoints. And with that, I'll pass it back to Matt.
So this is, like I said, there's a lot to digest across these. And really what we covered today kind of starts to just get that mental model prepared for you. There's many more nuances to dive into. I'll talk about that in a second. But let's go back to our first 4 questions and think about what were the answers to these, right? So the first one, do we have to change our general approach? No, but, right? The but is understanding how to apply what we do know in our security practitioner mindset and mechanisms, controls, capabilities, requirements to generative AI unique considerations. One great example Mike called out is in the current generation of LLMs, you can't think of it in the traditional relational database model of I trained on a corpus of data 8 billion records, and one of them was PII, and I just want to delete that row. It doesn't work that way, right? You'd have to retrain or refine-tune the model. So understanding the implications of that and maybe using something like RAG, right? We just need to understand how to approach it different in the solutioning. So what are the intersections of generative AI and security? There were 3. So we're thinking about how do we secure generative AI workloads, right? So that's my business wants to build something or use something. What do I need to do to make that secure and enable them? Be the department of yes and not the department of no. How do we use generative AI to secure? So as a security practitioner, what can I do to make my life easier or upskill my workforce with generative AI? I just got done doing a chalk talk on that. That was really fun and exciting. I don't know if anybody in the audience saw that, but really great talk, and they shared a lot of their ideas and what they're experimenting with. So it's awesome to hear what customers are learning and experimenting with. Talk with a lot of partners on what they're doing in that area. It's exciting as well. And then finally, securing from generative AI threats. And, again, the examples there of what might be happening with crafting spear phishing attacks, and what do we as an industry do to help across these things, and what do we do? So we're tackling all 3 of these. So mechanisms. What mechanisms? Obviously, this is a pretty simple one. Start with the security scoping matrix. Don't be afraid to use this. Adapt it to your organization's needs. It starts as a mental model, but it's something that you can put together into a framework within your existing procurement and build mechanisms at your workforce. And we are also always open for understanding, as this industry changes, how can we best reconcile the right lessons learned and prescriptions that help people adopt that. And finally, what are some examples? And we talked about not just the 5 scopes, but each of those primary security dimensions across those scopes and how to approach it. And if you start from that mindset, you can start to filter down into the hierarchies there and understand how that will impact your workloads. So as I said, we just kind of scratched the surface. I'll leave this slide up for a moment. We got 4 QR codes here. The first QR code there goes to really our public launch, if you will, last year of the GenAI Security Scoping Matrix, and we give some more examples and highlights on that blog. It's a collection of a team of effort that put this together. So Mike and I have the privilege of being the representatives of that team's work, but I do want to call out the great work that team did to make that happen. And then the team also built some next layer of the onion deep dives into how to build controls, how to think about the governance and compliance perspectives. And we continue to work with our network of deep SMEs on the topic here to launch more and more, both public documentation as well as prescriptions through blogs and other channels. So look forward to those as well. So on behalf of Mike and myself, we really want to thank everybody for being at our talk today, being at Inforce 24 here in Philly with us all. I really hope everybody gets everything they need to get out of this, goes back, feels energized, enthused to work. Our contact information is on there. We love to talk to customers, but have a wonderful conference. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.